I gazed at the letter clutched in my hand, a slow burn of anger building within me. The nerve, the absolute, unmitigated audacity of these individuals was truly a spectacle. The Homeowners Association of Maple Creek Estates was giving me a 48-hour ultimatum to get my boat off my own lake or incur a daily fine of $500. They went as far as to threaten having it towed at my own cost. A laugh escaped me as I scanned the patronizing text, which was saturated with a false sense of power. These arrogant officials had no inkling of the person they were dealing with. For years, they had been freely enjoying my family's lake without any authorization, and now they were attempting to impose their rules on me, on my own land. This was certainly going to be captivating. My name is Jake Sullivan, and up until 6 months ago, I was just another burned-out software engineer toiling away in Silicon Valley. I had dedicated the past 10 years to establishing a startup that provided cybersecurity solutions for financial companies. While it wasn't the most glamorous job, it was intellectually stimulating and financially rewarding. When a huge tech firm made an offer to acquire our company for a figure that had more zeros than I had ever dreamed of seeing in my bank balance, I knew it was time for a different lifestyle. At 40 years old, I was financially stable and utterly exhausted. I craved tranquility and silence, far from the relentless pace and perpetual meetings. It was then that the lake house came to mind. Sullivan Lake had been part of my family for 3 generations. My grandfather, a man who transitioned from commercial fishing to conservation, had bought the 50-acre lake and the surrounding property in the 1950s, when the region consisted of little more than farmland and woods. He constructed a humble cabin on the lake's edge and lived out his retirement fishing, writing, and educating local children on respecting the natural world. I have sharp memories of summers at the lake with him, where I learned how to fish and listened to his tales of the past, when the water was so pristine you could see 20 feet to the bottom. He was a local hero of sorts, renowned for opposing a mining corporation that aimed to ruin the local watershed. "Water is life, Jake," he would say, his voice deep but kind. "Not just for the fish, but for every one of us. Don't ever let somebody persuade you that profit is more vital than preserving what nature has provided." Those words resonated with me over the years, even as I built a career in technology thousands of miles away. My father looked after the property but seldom visited, as his job required constant travel. He was more of a city dweller, never forming the same bond with the lake that my grandfather and I shared. When they both passed away within a 2-year span, my grandfather at 92 and my father suddenly from a heart attack at 67, the lake and cabin became my inheritance. I hadn't been back in nearly 5 years, consumed by building my business, handling investors, and navigating the fiercely competitive tech world. Now, however, it felt like the ideal sanctuary. I had the cabin updated, preserving its rustic feel while incorporating modern conveniences like dependable internet and new plumbing, and I moved in just as winter was transitioning to spring. The serenity I discovered there was precisely what I had been seeking. Mornings were for coffee on the dock, afternoons were for working on small projects around the land, and evenings were for watching the sun go down from my small fishing boat in the center of the lake. The pressures of meetings and deadlines slowly dissolved, giving way to the cycles of nature and the simple joys of lakeside living. It was idyllic, or at least it had been, until the HOA chose to assert its authority. That particular morning began as any other. I rose with the dawn, brewed a pot of dark coffee, and carried my mug to the dock where my 16-foot aluminum fishing boat was moored. It was nothing elaborate, just a straightforward, functional boat, ideal for a single person to explore the lake and do some light fishing. It had been my grandfather's, and despite its weathered appearance, I had kept it in excellent running order. There was a profound sense of contentment in using the same vessel he had used for decades, letting my fingers skim the same water and gazing at the same shorelines. I spotted the paper instantly, a glaring neon orange sheet affixed to my boat's side with what looked like waterproof adhesive. "Violation notice," it declared in stark black font. I tore it off and read the absurd message about unauthorized watercraft and aesthetic standards violations. This notice claimed my boat was out of step with community visual guidelines and had to be taken from community waters. It also stated that all boats were required to be registered with the HOA and bear the correct community decals. I chuckled, assuming it was some kind of joke, until I returned to the cabin and discovered the formal letter in my mailbox, complete with HOA letterhead and the signature of a certain Richard Wilkins, HOA president. I was still looking at the letter when my phone buzzed. It was Ray Delgado, my nearest neighbor, and one of the few individuals I had become acquainted with since my arrival. Ray, in his mid-70s, had known my grandfather well and resided about a quarter-mile down the shore in a home he constructed himself 50 years prior. A retired carpenter with tough hands and a constant tan from a lifetime of working outdoors, he and I, despite the age gap, had connected right away over our mutual enjoyment of fishing and aversion to pointless regulations. "Morning, Jake. Looks like the welcoming committee finally caught up with you," he remarked with a wry laugh when I picked up. I explained the notice and letter, and he let out a heavy sigh. Those HOA vultures get more audacious each year. They began constructing that upscale development on the North Shore about 10 years back, and ever since, they've behaved as if they owned everything for 5 miles around. Your grandfather would have chased them off with a shotgun loaded with rock salt. The thought brought a smile to my face. Grandpa Sullivan was indeed famous for his straightforward method of dealing with trespassers. I inquired if Ray had also had issues with them. "Oh, they tried it with me once, complaining my boat shed was an eyesore." I told Richard Wilkins exactly where he could put his violation notice. "They haven't bothered me since, but they're likely just biding their time until I pass away so they can pester whoever buys my property. You ought to know, they've been using your lake for their high-end fishing contests for years. They even have a private group they call the Elite Anglers or some other highfalutin nonsense. Just a bunch of weekend enthusiasts in pricey gear who couldn't catch a fish to save their lives, if you ask me. Your grandfather would be spinning in his grave if he knew they were using his lake like it was their private country club." That piece of information stunned me. It hadn't occurred to me to see if anyone was using the lake while the property was unoccupied, having naively believed that the concept of private property still held some meaning. After my call with Ray, I did some research online and found precisely what he had described. The Maple Creek Estates HOA website was adorned with pictures from their annual lakeside fishing derby, featuring grinning men in expensive fishing attire proudly showing off their catches on my lake. The Elite Anglers Club had its own dedicated page, bragging about its exclusive access to prime fishing waters and listing future events. There were numerous photos of large gatherings on the eastern bank of the lake, which was undeniably my property, showing tents, barbecues, and even a makeshift dock they must have put in for their events. The latest entry announced their most significant tournament of the year, planned for the next weekend, with a $5,000 prize and a catered barbecue by the lake. They were, in effect, organizing a huge event on my land without even a hint of asking for permission. The nerve was astounding. I sifted through years of photos and announcements, my disbelief growing with every click. They had been engaged in this activity for a minimum of 5 years, evidently exploiting the fact that no one was living at the cabin year-round to slowly claim authority over the lake. One post went so far as to call Sullivan Lake our community's crown jewel, as though they possessed any entitlement to it. I needed guidance from someone who grasped the legal ramifications, so I contacted my friend, Emma Porter. Emma and I had become friends in college and had kept in touch. She was now an environmental attorney who specialized in water rights and land use law, precisely the kind of expert I required. She was one of the few who comprehended why I had left a thriving tech career to live by a lake. "Let me understand this correctly," she said after I laid out the situation. "You own the lake, as in you hold the deed to the lakebed and the water rights, and they are instructing you that your boat cannot be on it?" I verified that this was indeed the situation, and she erupted in laughter. "Oh, this is priceless. And they've been using it for their functions without your consent?" "Jake, they have absolutely no legal basis. This is trespassing, pure and simple." I asked her for advice on my next move. "Don't reply to their notice just yet," she suggested. "Let's collect some proof first. If they've been at this for years, we should document everything before they can erase their history. I'll come up this weekend, and we can look over your deeds and property records to make sure everything is solid. In the meantime, you might want to install some security cameras around the lake. I have a feeling this is about to get interesting. And Jake, whatever you do, don't let them take your boat. If they attempt to move it, that's theft. It's as straightforward as that. Be sure to record everything." Acting on Emma's recommendation, I set up wireless security cameras at key locations around the lake, concentrating on the spots where the HOA appeared to host their events, based on the online photos. The cameras were inconspicuous yet high definition, equipped with night vision and motion sensors that would send an alert to my phone whenever anyone neared the lake. I also went through my father's files and located all the original deeds and property papers, which confirmed what I already knew. Sullivan Lake was, without a doubt, my private property, including the water rights and all land extending 15 feet from the high water mark around its entire circumference. There was even a survey map from 2010 that my father had commissioned, which distinctly showed the property lines. I was still examining these papers when I got an email inviting me to the next HOA meeting. It wasn't sent to me specifically, it looked like a generic email to everyone in the vicinity. Intrigued by what these people were like, I chose to go as an observer. It would be my first opportunity to see Richard Wilkins and the HOA board in person, and I had no intention of missing it. The meeting took place at the Maple Creek Estates Community Center, a showy structure with pillars and a fountain out front that seemed to be trying too hard to command respect. I entered quietly and found a seat in the last row. Roughly 30 people were there, most of whom looked as if they would prefer to be anywhere else. Richard Wilkins was the personification of my expectations, a man in his mid-50s with impeccably styled silver hair, sporting a blue blazer with gold buttons and a country club smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He conducted the meeting with the self-assuredness of a minor despot, talking at length about lawn maintenance rules and approved mailbox styles. When he finally addressed the subject of lake regulations, I straightened in my seat. "We've received reports of an unapproved boat being kept on community waters," he stated, a hint of irritation in his voice. "I want to remind all of you that every watercraft must be registered with the HOA and adhere to our aesthetic standards. The lake is one of our community's most precious resources, and we are obligated to preserve its immaculate condition." I couldn't restrain myself. I put my hand up. Richard Wilkins seemed taken aback, evidently not used to questions from the audience during his speeches. But he gestured toward me. "Yes, the man in the back." I got to my feet, maintaining a relaxed and inquisitive tone. "I was hoping you could clear something up about the lake. When you refer to community waters, what does that mean exactly? Who is the owner of the lake?" A low hum of conversation spread through the room, and I saw a few residents turn to look at me with curiosity. Richard's smile became just a little more strained. "The lake is a community asset that is managed by the HOA. It has been that way since the development was first built." His tone was condescending, clearly meant to end the discussion, but I hadn't finished. I continued to press. "So, the HOA possesses a deed for the lake, or is it county property that the HOA oversees through some kind of formal arrangement?" Several residents were now listening intently, and I noticed an older man nodding in agreement with my query. Richard was becoming visibly flustered, his grip on the podium tightening until his knuckles were white. "There are long-standing arrangements in place. The exact details are not pertinent to this meeting, but I can guarantee you that the HOA has complete authority to oversee all activities on the lake." His tone had become clipped, but I kept my expression one of innocent curiosity. "That's very interesting. I would be keen to review those documents at some point, just for my own information." Richard swiftly proceeded to the next topic on the agenda, but not before I saw him shoot a worried look at a woman I would later identify as Karen Mitchell, the HOA vice president. For the rest of the meeting, I could feel their gazes on me from time to time, surely speculating about who I was and why I was asking about the lake. After the meeting concluded and people were packing up to leave, a man came up to me and introduced himself as Gerald Thompson, president of the Elite Anglers Club. He appeared to be in his 60s, with the sun-beaten face of an avid outdoorsman and the firm handshake of someone accustomed to having his way. He had on a high-end fishing vest over a polo shirt and a cap adorned with the club's emblem. "I haven't seen you here before. You must be a new resident," he commented, assessing me with a well-practiced smile. I told him that I had recently taken up residence at my family's property on the lake. His eyebrows lifted in surprise. "The old Sullivan place? The one that's been vacant for years?" We assumed it might have been deserted. There was a calculating look in his eyes that made me cautious. I assured him it was far from deserted and was still very much Sullivan land. "I'm Jake Sullivan, by the way. My grandfather was the one who built that cabin." A flicker of understanding crossed his face. "Sullivan, of course. I ran into your grandfather once, a long time ago. A real character." The way he uttered the word character made it evident it wasn't intended as a compliment. He seemed to weigh his next words with care. "Well, a warm welcome to the neighborhood. You should be aware that we have a fantastic fishing club, highly exclusive, but I might be able to arrange for your entry." We have access to the choicest locations on the lake. The absurdity of him extending an invitation to me for my own lake was almost too much to handle, but I kept a neutral expression. That's intriguing. When is your next function? He swelled with pride. Our annual championship is scheduled for next Saturday. It's the most significant event of the year, right there on the East Shore. You should stop by and see what we're about. I expressed my gratitude for the invitation, already scheming how I would leverage this forthcoming tournament to collect more proof of their trespassing. I thanked him for the invitation and was on the verge of leaving when I caught snippets of Richard Wilkins talking in hushed tones with Gerald and Karen Mitchell near the snack table. I made myself busy with a cup of subpar coffee, trying to overhear their discussion. I couldn't catch everything, but the phrases "speed up the timeline" and "resolve the Sullivan matter before it's too late" were clearly audible. Karen shot a glance in my direction, and they immediately lowered their voices, moving away from the table. Whatever their plan was, it obviously concerned my property, and my sudden presence had them worried. As I headed to my car, I decided to ring Emma again to fill her in on what I had discovered. They're definitely concealing something, she concurred. The fact that Wilkins wouldn't give a straight answer to your question about ownership is very telling. And this timeline they mentioned, it sounds as if they have some kind of development project in mind. Let's examine those documents of yours tomorrow when I get there. I was just about to head home when I saw a polished BMW drive up next to me in the parking area. The window descended to show Richard Wilkins himself. Mr. Sullivan, isn't it? I don't think we were formally introduced. I'm Richard Wilkins, president of the Maple Creek Estates HOA. His smile was all teeth, devoid of any genuine warmth. I hear you've recently taken up residence in the old cabin on the lake. We really should have a discussion about getting it up to community standards. I returned his artificial smile with one of my own. I wasn't aware that my property was under the authority of your HOA, Mr. Wilkins. His smile remained, but a brief emotion crossed his eyes, annoyance, perhaps, or worry. All properties in this vicinity are included in our community vision, Mr. Sullivan. We take great pride in upholding certain standards. Your boat, for example, is a bit too rustic for our liking. He practically hissed the word rustic, as though my grandfather's impeccably maintained fishing boat was an affront to him. I chose to feign ignorance a little longer. Is that so? And what power does the HOA hold over boats on the lake? Richard's smile became even more rigid. As I stated in the meeting, the lake is under the management of the HOA. It has been for many years. He gestured dismissively, as if that should be the end of the matter. I nodded with a thoughtful expression. That's quite interesting, because based on my family's deed, Sullivan Lake is private land owned by the Sullivan family since 1953. Has there been a change that I'm unaware of? For a brief second, Richard's composure faltered, and I caught a glimpse of real alarm before he regained his poise. It seems there are some misunderstandings regarding long-standing arrangements. It might be best if we have our legal counsel discuss this. In the meantime, I trust you will adhere to our request concerning your boat. It would be a pity to begin our association on a sour note. The threat was barely disguised but clear. I simply smiled and informed him I would consider his concerns. As he departed, I had the strong sense that the lines of conflict had just been established. When I arrived home, I found that Richard Wilkins had acted swiftly. My boat was missing from the dock, with only a property violation notice left behind. The notice indicated that the boat had been seized for failing to meet community standards and could be retrieved upon payment of a $750 fine and the signing of a compliance form. The document also warned that the boat would be deemed abandoned and sold at auction if not retrieved within 30 days. I was furious, pacing the dock and resisting the impulse to drive directly to Wilkins' office to challenge him. Instead, I took several deep breaths, recalling my grandfather's advice. When you're mad, that's the time to slow down and think more clearly than ever. This was no longer just about a boat. It was about confronting bullies who had been exploiting my family's property for years. I contacted the local sheriff's office to report the theft, but was informed that it was a civil dispute between me and the HOA. The deputy I talked to sounded uneasy, remarking that these HOA conflicts could become messy and recommended that I try to resolve the issue directly with the association. His hesitance to intervene made me wonder if the HOA had connections in the sheriff's department or if they had just managed to persuade local authorities that they possessed power they didn't actually have. By the time Emma showed up the next morning, My anger had transformed into a cold, methodical resolve. We dedicated the day to examining all my documents, laying them out on the cabin's spacious dining table. Emma's legal knowledge was indispensable as we confirmed, without any question, that I had undisputed ownership of the lake and the adjacent land. These deeds are airtight, she declared, examining the legal text. Your grandfather was meticulous in defining the property lines, and your father's survey confirms it. Emma had also found something noteworthy in the county records she had obtained before her visit. The initial development plans for Maple Creek Estates explicitly stated that Sullivan Lake was private land and not included in the development. They have been deceiving their own residents, Emma stated, tapping the document with her finger. According to these records, they never possessed any authority to control lake user entry. They've essentially been trespassing for all these years. We also looked at the security camera footage I had installed, which had already recorded several residents putting their boats in the water from what they clearly believed was HOA land, but was, in fact, my property. This is excellent proof, Emma said. Now, we need to determine their ultimate goal. Something more significant is happening here than just them giving you a hard time about your boat. Based on what you heard about, speeding up the timeline, it seems they are aiming for something specific. Our answer arrived later that afternoon when Ray Delgado came by with a compelling piece of news. My niece is employed at the county planning department, he said. She contacted me this morning because she noticed a preliminary application on her desk. Maple Creek Estates is applying for a permit for a major expansion, a high-end lakeside resort featuring condos, a marina, and a golf course. And guess which lake they intend to build it on? The pieces of the puzzle began to fit together. Richard Wilkins and his associates were not just engaging in petty tyranny. They were preparing for a multi-million-dollar development on property they did not own. They had likely been orchestrating this for years, gradually creating the illusion that the HOA was in charge of the lake, probably thinking that the Sullivan family had either forgotten about the land or would be open to selling. My sudden return and inquiries about ownership had put a major obstacle in their path. That evening, Emma and I started to devise our plan, sitting at the kitchen table with food from a local diner. We could go all out right away, she suggested, twirling her fork in her pasta. Issue a cease and desist, bring trespassing charges against the HOA, and insist on the immediate return of your boat. But that might reveal our strategy too soon. I concurred, taking a thoughtful sip of my beer. I want to find out more about their plans and who else is involved. Let's postpone any direct confrontation for now. Instead, we opted for a more discreet strategy. Emma composed a letter to the HOA board, asking for copies of all papers related to the ownership and management of the lake, as well as details about the Elite Anglers Club's use of it. The letter was phrased carefully to appear as a reasonable request for information, not a direct challenge to their power. This will serve as a warning that someone is making inquiries, but it won't show that we know about the development plans, Emma clarified. We also agreed to let the upcoming fishing tournament go ahead as scheduled, with the security cameras capturing everything. The more proof we had of them using my land without consent, the more advantageous our position would be when we finally made our move. In the meantime, I got a formal letter from Steve Barnes, the HOA's lawyer, repeating the demand that I follow HOA rules and threatening legal action if I kept interfering with community operations. The letter was filled with ambiguous mentions of historical precedent and established community standards, but noticeably omitted any specific legal basis for their authority over my land. Emma assisted me in writing a reply that acknowledged their letter but made no commitments, giving us more time. This is actually to our benefit, she remarked as we put the finishing touches on the wording. It indicates they're becoming anxious but lack any solid legal grounds for their assertions. If they possessed actual proof to back up their claims, their lawyer would have explicitly mentioned it. I also got in touch with Sarah Lynn, a journalist for the local paper, whom Ray had told me had previously covered stories about HOA overreach. We arranged to have coffee at a small cafe in town, located far enough from Maple Creek Estates to prevent being noticed by any HOA members. Sarah, in her mid-30s, had keen eyes and the kind of sharp focus that characterizes good journalists. She listened intently as I recounted some of what was happening, making sure not to disclose our entire plan. So, they've been using your lake for years without your permission, and now they're attempting to prevent you from using your own boat on it, she summarized. That's typical HOA overreach, but it feels like there's more to this story. Sarah was instantly intrigued, particularly when I brought up the resort development plans. I've been hearing whispers about a large-scale project, but no one has been willing to speak publicly, she said, jotting down notes. If they intend to build on private land without the owner's agreement, that's a significant story. I requested that she delay publishing anything for the time being, but to stay alert for any news about the development plans and the investors involved. The day prior to the fishing tournament, Richard Wilkins showed up at my house without any prior notice. I had just finished my morning coffee and was looking at some of the security camera footage when the doorbell rang. His attitude was different this time, less self-important, more conciliatory. He had swapped his blazer for a more relaxed button-down shirt, likely in an effort to seem more friendly. "Mr. Sullivan, I believe we started off on the wrong foot," he began with that same rehearsed smile. "I realize you have concerns about your boat. I'm confident we can find a solution." I welcomed him inside, eager to hear his proposal. He made a point of praising the renovated cabin, remarking on its rustic charm with a barely veiled tone of superiority. "The HOA is prepared to grant an exception for your boat," he went on, making himself comfortable on my living room couch. "You can leave it on the lake, no issues. All we require is that you sign this straightforward agreement that acknowledges the HOA's managerial authority over lake activities." He presented me with a document that, in essence, asked me to accept the HOA's control over Sullivan Lake in return for permission to keep my boat there. It was so obviously designed to benefit him that I nearly laughed out loud. Instead, I inquired with an innocent air, "And what about the fishing tournament tomorrow? Would this agreement apply to that as well?" Richard's gaze sharpened slightly. "You're aware of that?" I shrugged nonchalantly. "Gerald Thompson invited me to come and observe. It sounds like a major event." Richard gave a slow nod. "Indeed, it's a community tradition. It's been going on for many years." A hint of exhaustion had crept into his demeanor, as if he were reassessing the current situation. I examined the agreement once more, feigning to mull it over. "And this resort development I've been hearing about, the one slated to be constructed on the lake's edge, would this agreement encompass that as well?" Richard was unable to completely conceal his astonishment. "I'm not certain what you've been told, but any development projects would proceed through the appropriate official procedures. This agreement is merely about fundamental lake usage rules." He gestured dismissively, attempting to minimize its importance, but his posture had grown rigid. I returned the document to him. "I'll need my lawyer to look this over. She has been quite curious about the lake's legal standing." Richard's amicable expression faltered for a brief moment. "Mr. Sullivan, I am attempting to be fair here. It would be in the best interest of everyone if we could settle this without conflict. There are financial prospects that could be advantageous to you as well, if you were open to being cooperative." There it was, the unspoken bribe. I maintained a non-committal expression. "I will consider it, Mr. Wilkins. In the meantime, I would be grateful for the return of my boat." He rose to his feet, evidently unhappy with the outcome of the conversation. "I will see what can be arranged, but you must realize that cooperation is a two-way street. The HOA has been overseeing this lake for a great many years, and we enjoy considerable community backing. It would be a shame if this escalated into a lengthy conflict." The threat was barely disguised. After his departure, I rang Emma to bring her up to speed. "He all but confessed they have no legal standing," I informed her, "and he alluded to including me in whatever development scheme they have in mind." Emma was not taken by surprise. A classic tactic. First, they try to scare you, and when that fails, they offer you a piece of the action. Tomorrow's tournament is shaping up to be quite an event. We put the final touches on our plan for the fishing tournament. Emma would come as my guest, and we would record everything without intervening. The real move would happen afterward. The morning of the tournament was bright and clear, ideal weather for fishing. From my cabin, I could see trucks towing boats start to show up on the eastern side of the lake. Gerald Thompson was overseeing the setup, erecting tents, tables, and even a makeshift bar. A large sign read, "15th Annual Elite Anglers Championship," with the Maple Creek Estates logo prominently featured. There were already at least 20 vehicles parked on my land, with more arriving steadily. Emma got there around mid-morning, and we observed the event from my deck using binoculars. "They aren't even attempting to be subtle," she noted as the crowd grew. "I can see at least 40 individuals and 15 boats, all on your land." Around noon, Richard Wilkins showed up with several smartly dressed people who were clearly not there for fishing. They were holding portfolios and pointing to various sections of the shoreline. "Those must be the investors," Emma remarked. "He's giving them a tour of the proposed building site." We took our cameras with long-range lenses and moved in closer, remaining concealed among the trees on my property. We could now overhear parts of Richard's presentation to the investors. Prime lakefront property, exclusive access. We already have control of the entire waterfront, just a few minor details to settle. He was displaying polished brochures with artists' impressions of what appeared to be a huge resort. One of the investors, a woman in a high-end suit, inquired about the current landowners. Richard's response was telling. Minimal complications. The majority of the shoreline is undeveloped. There is one holdout we are currently negotiating with, but that should be settled shortly. We have been effectively overseeing the lake for years. Making our control official is merely a procedural step at this stage. He was completely distorting the truth, behaving as though he had power he did not possess and suggesting that I was nearly in agreement with their project. The group proceeded, examining what seemed to be initial architectural plans. Feeling that we had gathered sufficient proof, Emma and I pulled back to finalize our strategy. It was time to put an end to this deception. While the fishing tournament was at its peak, with boats dotted across the lake and a large crowd enjoying the barbecue on the bank, we set our plan in motion. First, Emma submitted an emergency injunction to the county court, utilizing our evidence to prove clear ownership of the lake and the imminent risk of damage from unauthorized use. The judge, after examining the conclusive proof of my ownership and the HOA's trespassing, approved the injunction without delay. With this legal safeguard established, I engaged a local security firm to place private property, no trespassing signs around the entire perimeter of the lake, with a special focus on the tournament location. Then, with a sheriff's deputy present to maintain order, Emma and I went to the gathering. The deputy requested everyone's attention, and suddenly all eyes were upon us as he declared that the event was being held on private land without the owner's consent and that everyone was required to leave immediately. The response was swift and disorganized. Gerald Thompson hurried over, his face flushed with anger and bewilderment. What in the world is this? We've been having this tournament for 15 years. Emma came forward, calm and professional. Mr. Thompson, Sullivan Lake is private property owned by Mr. Sullivan. The HOA has never possessed the legal right to authorize access or events on this lake. We hold an injunction from Judge Harmon that confirms this and mandates all unauthorized individuals to leave the property at once. She displayed the court order, which appeared to have more impact than our spoken words. Richard Wilkins elbowed his way through the crowd, his investors observing with unease from a distance. This is absurd. The lake has been managed by the HOA for decades. He was almost yelling, his carefully maintained composure completely gone. Emma presented him with a copy of the injunction and my property deed. That is demonstrably incorrect, Mr. Wilkins. County records explicitly show that the Sullivan family has held continuous ownership since 1953. Your HOA has been trespassing all these years. Furthermore, we have proof that you have been misrepresenting your authority to potential investors, which could be considered fraud. The crowd of fishermen and onlookers started to whisper among themselves, many appearing confused and annoyed. A man came forward, introducing himself as a resident of Maple Creek Estates. We were informed that our HOA dues covered lake maintenance and access. Are you suggesting we have been deceived? His question seemed to echo the thoughts of many, as several others nodded in agreement. Emma nodded with empathy. I'm afraid that's the case. The records we've examined indicate that the HOA has been falsely claiming authority over this lake for years. More residents started to ask questions, their frustration now aimed at Richard and the present HOA board members. The investors were already making their way back to their cars, clearly wanting no involvement in this public dispute. The sheriff's deputy's voice rose above the increasing noise. Folks, I need everyone to start packing up your gear and leaving the property in a calm manner. The court order is explicit, and I am here to ensure it is followed. Gerald Thompson continued to object, but people were already starting to take down the tents and pack their equipment. Richard Wilkins cornered me, his face a mask of barely restrained anger. You have no clue what you've just done, Sullivan. I have contacts in this county you can't even fathom. This is far from over. His effort to intimidate might have succeeded with someone else, but after years of tense business dealings in Silicon Valley, his threat seemed almost comical. I met his stare with a calm expression. Actually, Richard, I believe it is. But if you wish to press the matter, you should be aware that I have recordings of you informing your investors that you have control of my lake and are in discussions with me. That sounds remarkably like fraud to me. I'm curious what they will think when they find out the truth. His face paled slightly, and he looked over at the now departing investors, who were evidently displeased with how things had unfolded. "This was merely a misunderstanding," he said, his voice losing some of its earlier assurance. "We can find a solution." I shook my head. "The time for finding solutions was before you took my boat and attempted to take my lake. Now, I must request that you depart from my property." As the crowd thinned and the last boats were secured on trailers, Sarah Lynn showed up with a photographer. She had received a tip about the dispute and was keen to get statements. Richard and the other HOA board members declined to talk to her, rushing to their vehicles, but several residents were more than willing to voice their anger at discovering they had been deceived about the lake rights. "We pay more than $500 a month in HOA fees," one woman informed Sarah, "and they assured us that a portion of that went toward lake upkeep and access. If they don't actually own the lake, where has that money been going?" It was a valid question, and from the sounds of agreement around her, many residents were asking the same thing. Sarah came to me for my version of events, and I gave her a straightforward summary of the HOA's behavior and my reaction, showing her the property deeds and the court injunction. "So what's the next step?" she inquired, her pen ready over her notepad. I gazed out at my now vacant lake, peaceful once more after the turmoil. "Next, I retrieve my boat, and then we'll find out what other secrets Mr. Wilkins has been keeping from his residents." The consequences were immediate and extensive. Sarah's report was featured on the front page of the local newspaper the following day, outlining the HOA's long-standing deception and the unsuccessful resort project. By that evening, the story had been circulated by regional news sources and was gaining traction on social media. The HOA convened an emergency meeting, which I attended with Emma and numerous irate residents. Richard Wilkins was notably absent, leaving Karen Mitchell to try and handle the irate crowd. The residents insisted on knowing what other falsehoods they had been told and where their HOA fees had actually been spent. Emma and I observed silently from the back as the HOA board disintegrated under the strain, with several members stepping down right then and there. I finally rose and spoke to the assembly. "I have no issue with the residents of Maple Creek Estates using the lake for recreational purposes. My problem was with the HOA leadership asserting power they did not possess and intending to build on my land without my approval. Perhaps we can establish a new agreement that honors property rights while permitting responsible access for the community." My words helped to ease some of the friction in the room, and a number of residents came up to me afterward to offer apologies for the incident and to show interest in reaching a just resolution. An older man shook my hand with a firm grip. "Your grandfather would be very proud," he remarked. "He always allowed the local kids to fish from his property, you know. He never refused anyone who showed respect for the lake." I hadn't been aware of that, and his comment resonated with me. Meanwhile, Emma's legal efforts were yielding further results. Based on the proof we had collected and the public reaction to Sarah's article, the county initiated an inquiry into the HOA's financial records. They were especially curious about where the funds allocated for lake upkeep had actually been spent over the years. In addition, Richard Wilkins Development Associates brought a lawsuit against him for fraudulent misrepresentation after discovering he had been negotiating to sell them access to a property he did not own. My boat was brought back the next day with a reluctant apology from the HOA's newly appointed interim president, who had been quickly chosen following the wave of resignations. The local sheriff's office, feeling a bit sheepish about their previous dismissal of my report, tasked a deputy with regularly patrolling the lake to prevent any more trespassing until a more lasting arrangement could be made. 2 weeks later, Sarah Lynn contacted me with an update that brought the whole situation to a close. "You're not going to believe this," she said, her voice filled with excitement. I looked into Richard Wilkins' history. He's not even a licensed real estate agent, as he asserted. His license was taken away in Florida 5 years ago for similar fraudulent activities, where he misrepresented property lines and sold access rights he didn't have. He slightly altered his name and came here to make a new start. She elaborated that in Florida, he had gone by the name Richard Williams and had been part of several questionable development projects before being exposed. He narrowly escaped criminal charges in Florida by reaching a settlement with his victims, but it seems his luck has run out this time. I've passed all of this information on to the county prosecutor. This explains so much about his boldness in the scheme and his alarm when confronted. The county prosecutor was now examining the evidence for potential criminal charges of fraud and misuse of HOA funds. Richard Wilkins had vanished, apparently skipping town in the dead of night as the situation became untenable. Karen Mitchell, when faced with this new information, insisted she was unaware of his past, but emails found during the investigation indicated otherwise. In the following months, I collaborated with the remaining HOA board members and residents to forge a new connection with the community. The new board was headed by the older gentleman who had spoken of my grandfather, a retired judge named Michael Davis, who had relocated to Maple Creek Estates for a quiet retirement, only to be unexpectedly propelled into a position of leadership. He was a person of integrity and directness, qualities that were noticeably absent in the prior administration. Together, we established the Sullivan Lake Conservation Trust, a nonprofit entity tasked with overseeing controlled public entry to certain areas of the lake while safeguarding the natural habitat my grandfather had strived to defend. Residents could buy affordable yearly access passes, with the proceeds dedicated to lake preservation and conservation initiatives. "This is how it should have been handled from the start," Judge Davis commented during one of our strategy sessions. "With honesty, openness, and a regard for property rights." I even permitted a reorganized version of the fishing club to hold their tournaments, now with the necessary permits and environmental regulations. The old exclusive membership rules and high fees were eliminated. The new Sullivan Lake Anglers was accessible to anyone who valued the lake and adhered to the conservation standards we had put in place. Gerald Thompson, as expected, wanted no part of the new system and left town soon after the scandal came to light. The Eastern Shore, where Richard had envisioned his resort, was instead designated as a small public park with a simple fishing pier and picnic spot, available to all members of the community. On the day of the park's inauguration, I installed a plaque in tribute to my grandfather, inscribed with his cherished motto, "Water is life, not a commodity to be bought and sold." As for my boat, I eventually managed to repaint it and perform some maintenance, but I intentionally kept its rustic look as a memento of how this all started. On peaceful mornings, I still guide it to the center of the lake with a fishing rod and a mug of coffee, just as my grandfather once did. Sometimes Ray Delgado comes along, sharing tales of the past and speculating on how my grandfather might have dealt with the HOA, usually with more colorful expressions and less legal subtlety than my own method. Emma visited often, pleased with our joint success and vigilant for any new dangers to the lake's peace. She was instrumental in creating the legal structure for the Conservation Trust, guaranteeing its ability to protect the lake long after my time. The "No Trespassing" signs were taken down, replaced by Sullivan Lake Conservation Area, markers that outlined sensible usage rules while recognizing the lake's private ownership. Sometimes the most rewarding triumph is not merely overcoming your opponents, but converting a conflict into a chance to create something superior. As I sit in my boat, observing families enjoying the new lakeside park and responsible anglers fishing respectfully, I can't help but feel that my grandfather would be pleased. He always maintained that the lake was not for just one individual. It was a resource to be safeguarded for all who would truly value it. The HOA tyrants who attempted to seize it have been succeeded by a community that honors both the natural environment and the rights of those who protect it. Richard Wilkins' ambitious vision for upscale condos and privileged access has, instead, served as an example of how private ownership and public good can coexist when approached correctly. Last week, I came across an old picture of my grandfather standing on the dock with his fishing boat, the very boat that initiated this entire saga. He is grinning from ear to ear, displaying a large base with the expansive lake behind him. I had it framed and placed it in the cabin's living room. Each time I see it, I am reminded of his foresight and resolve, traits I trust one have inherited, at least to some degree. And every time I take my non-compliant boat out onto my very own lake, I can't help but smile at the final outcome. Sometimes, making a stand is not just about safeguarding what belongs to you. It's about demonstrating a better path for others. The lake is now in better condition than it has been for years, with clearer water and a greater variety of wildlife, proof that responsible management is more effective than uncontrolled expansion. As my grandfather would say, look after the water, and the water will look after everything else. These are words to live by, especially when confronted with entitled HOAs that are out of their depth.